The morning Silas Crown stepped onto her land, he didn't knock. He didn't call ahead. He climbed out of his polished carriage, adjusted his coat like a man who had already won, looked Marin Kestrel in the eye. This woman who had bled through 2 winters on 40 acres everyone said were worthless, and held out $200 like he was doing her a favor. "Take it," he said. "Walk away. Nobody here will think less of you." He was wrong about that. But he was right about one thing. Nobody in Briar Hollow had ever thought much of Marin Kestrel at all. What would you have done? What would you have said to a man holding money in one hand and your entire future in the other? If this kind of story moves you, real grit, real stakes, real people making impossible choices, subscribe right now and hit the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. And drop a comment below with your city or country. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button too. It tells me you want more. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The auction started at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning in early October, and Marin Kestrel arrived alone. She had walked 4 miles from her rented room above the feed store, wearing her second-best dress because her best one had a tear along the left shoulder she hadn't had time to mend. She carried a small leather purse that held $81, every cent she had managed to scrape together since her husband Daniel had died 18 months earlier, leaving her with a milk goat, a wagon with a cracked axle, a cheese press that was older than both of them combined, and a stack of debts that took her 6 months just to sort through. She was 31 years old. She looked 40. That wasn't self-pity. That was just the arithmetic of grief and hard work laid on top of each other without a rest. The courthouse square in Briar Hollow was already crowded when she got there. A county tax sale drew a certain kind of man, the kind who liked to watch other people's misfortune turn into opportunity. There were farmers in worn coats, bankers in clean ones, a land speculator from the city who had driven in the night before and taken the only decent room at the hotel. There were also just regular townspeople who had nothing better to do and liked the entertainment of a public auction the way some people liked card games. You never quite knew who you'd see lose. Marin found a spot near the back of the crowd and waited. The first 3 parcels sold quickly. A strip of creek bottom land went to a farmer named Holt for $60. A half-acre lot near the mill went to the bank's representative for $45. Nobody lingered over those. Then the auctioneer, a thin man named Petty, who had been conducting these sales for 20 years and had developed a particular flat tone that communicated nothing, cleared his throat and read from his paper. Parcel 47, former Crown Estate. 40 acres, ridge property, approximately 1 mile east of the mill road. Current condition, uncultivable. Minimum bid, $50. There was a short silence. Then someone laughed. Not meanly, at first. Just the way a man laughs when he hears something absurd. A short, startled sound. But it spread quickly, the way those things always do in a crowd, and within a few seconds there were a dozen men chuckling, a few shaking their heads, and the speculator from the city leaning over to whisper something to the banker beside him that Marin couldn't hear but didn't need to. She knew what everyone in that square already knew about Parcel 47. The Crown property had once been, by all accounts, one of the finest farms in the county. That was decades ago, before the family had moved to the city and left it in the hands of a succession of tenant farmers who gradually stopped fighting the land and eventually stopped showing up altogether. In the years since, bamboo had taken over. Not slowly, the way people sometimes described it in romantic terms, but aggressively, the way a fire takes a dry field. It spread from the creek bank and worked its way uphill and swallowed everything. The house, the barns. The orchard that had once produced fruit people drove from neighboring counties to buy. The fences, the pastures, all of it gone under a 12-foot wall of green that swayed in the wind and rustled constantly like something alive and waiting. Farmers had tried to clear it. 3 separate attempts over 15 years, the stories went. Axes wore out. Fire spread to places it wasn't supposed to go and scorched a neighbor's fence line before it was beaten back. A team of mules had been brought in once to plow the root systems under, and 2 of them had come up lame in the process, while the bamboo sent up new shoots within 2 weeks, like nothing had happened at all. The county had finally given up, assessed the property as worthless, and let the taxes lapse until the debt was large enough to justify a sale. $50. That was what they thought 40 acres of buried history was worth. Nobody bid. Marin watched the auctioneer wait. She watched the speculator examine his fingernails. She watched a farmer near the front shift his weight from foot to foot and say something under his breath to the man beside him. She raised her hand. 50, she said. The laughter came back, louder this time. She didn't look around to find its source. There was no point. She kept her eyes on the auctioneer, who blinked at her once, then twice, apparently uncertain what the appropriate professional response was to a widow bidding on the county's most notorious worthless parcel. 50, he confirmed, in his flat voice. No one else moved. 60, she said, before anyone could mock her into silence. That was when she heard his voice for the first time. Not Silas Crown. He wasn't there that day. But Harrison Webb, the president of Briar Hollow's only bank, a heavy man with a white beard who had turned down Marin's loan application 6 weeks earlier with a look that mixed pity and mild contempt in roughly equal measure. "Young lady," Webb said, from somewhere to her left, loudly enough that the whole crowd could hear it, "I strongly advise you to put your hand down." She turned and looked at him. "I appreciate the advice," she said. "I don't need it." Webb shook his head like a man watching a child touch a hot stove. 70, Marin said. The auctioneer, who had recovered his composure, repeated it. Still no other bids. The speculator from the city had completely lost interest. He'd come for the creek bottom land and already gotten it. The farmers who might have bid in another life weren't foolish enough to throw money at 40 acres of bamboo, and the bank had already written parcel 47 off as unrecoverable. 80, she said. She felt her hands go cold. Not from the October air. $80 was almost everything. One more bid and she was out. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in the rented room above the feed store, lying on the narrow bed with the ceiling inches above her and Daniel's wool coat folded on the chair beside her because she couldn't make herself put it away yet. She had written the numbers down on the back of an old envelope and looked at them until they made sense to her. She had told herself the logic slowly, the way you explain something to a frightened child. Bamboo is grass. Goats eat grass. I have a goat. One goat can become many goats. Many goats can clear many acres, given enough time. The math wasn't pretty, but it was honest. 80, the auctioneer confirmed. Going once. Silence. Going twice. Marin held her breath. Sold. $80 to... The auctioneer paused, peering at her. I'm sorry, ma'am. Your name? Marin Kestrel, she said clearly, loudly enough that every person in that square heard it. She paid $80, received her deed, and walked back through the crowd. Several people stepped aside to let her through. A few wouldn't meet her eyes. One woman, the wife of a feed merchant, touched her arm briefly as she passed and said nothing, but the touch felt like sympathy and also a little like a warning. Harrison Webb was still shaking his head as she passed him. You've thrown your money away, he said, not unkindly. That was the thing about Webb. He wasn't a cruel man. He just had no imagination. Maybe, she said. She kept walking. She had $1 left. What? The 40 acres were worse than she expected, and she had expected them to be bad. Marin went out the next morning with an old pair of leather gloves Daniel had used for fence work and stood at the edge of the property line for a long time before she went in. The bamboo began at the old fence posts. You could see the rusted wire buried in the cane if you looked carefully, and extended up the ridge in an unbroken mass that absorbed sound and light both. It was cold inside that edge. Not bitterly cold, just the particular cold of a place where the sun couldn't reach the ground. She pushed 6 feet in and stopped. The cane closed behind her almost immediately. She pushed forward with her elbow, then with her shoulder, trying to get a sense of density, of direction, of whether there was any system to the thing or if it was just chaos from edge to edge. The stalks were hard. Not like wood exactly, but harder than she'd expected from something called grass. They sliced through her gloves at the creased parts where the leather had thinned. The sound they made was dry and hollow, like something that had already died and was only waiting for someone to notice. She stood in the middle of that green dark for a few minutes and didn't say anything. She thought about Daniel. Not his face, she could still see his face clearly, which she was grateful for, but his hands. He had been a practical man. Not inspired, not adventurous, but deeply, bone-level practical in a way that she had sometimes found frustrating when he was alive and now missed with a physical ache that surprised her with its location. It wasn't her heart. It was her hands. She missed the way his hands had known what to do. She looked down at her own hands inside the ruined gloves. Figure it out, she thought. She backed out of the bamboo, walked to the stone wall at the southern edge of the property. The only thing visible above the cane, an old foundation wall maybe 2 feet high, and sat down. She needed a shelter before she could begin clearing. She needed more goats before she could clear efficiently. She needed a water source before she could keep more goats. She had $1, a milk goat named Hattie, a wagon that still needed a new axle pin, and the kind of tiredness that came not from lack of sleep, but from having made too many hard decisions in too short a time. She was trying to decide which problem to solve first when she heard footsteps on the ridge road. Orin Vale was 73 years old, small and dry and brown like a piece of leather left in the sun too long, and he had been farming the 40 acres on the other side of the ridge road for 41 years. He walked with a cane, not because he needed it, Marin would later learn, but because he found it useful in the same practical way he found everything useful, and he had a way of stopping and looking at a thing for a very long time before he said anything about it. He stopped at the edge of the property. He looked at the bamboo. He looked at Marin sitting on the foundation wall. He looked at the bamboo again. "Bought yourself quite a project," he said finally. "I know it," she said. "People think you're a fool." "I know that too." He nodded slowly, like a man filing information away. "You got a plan, or you just got the deed?" Marin looked at him. She had seen Orin Vale around town her whole life and had never spoken to him directly. He had the reputation of a man who didn't waste words, which meant he was either very wise or very dull, and she had never been close enough to find out which. "I've got a plan," she said. "I'm not sure it's a good one." "Tell me." She told him. She laid it out the way she had worked it out on the back of that envelope. The goats, the bamboo, the slow clearing, the time it would take. She told him she thought there might be something under the bamboo worth saving. She didn't say why she thought that. It was just a feeling, and feelings weren't evidence, and she wasn't in the habit of defending feelings to strangers. When she finished, Orin Vale was quiet for a moment. "The soil still remembers what it was," he said. "It only needs the right hands." She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. "I've got 4 goats," he said. "Old ones, but sound. I'm past the age of managing a large herd, and I'll be honest with you, they eat more than they produce, and I keep them out of stubbornness more than sense." He paused. "I'll give you the 4 goats and 40 years of knowing this ridge. In exchange, 1/4 of whatever this land produces, for as long as it produces." Marin looked at him for a long time. "You don't know me," she said. "I know enough." "What do you know?" He looked at the bamboo. "You bought 40 acres nobody wanted, with money nobody thought you had, in front of a crowd that laughed at you. And you're still sitting here making plans instead of going home." He turned back to her. "That's enough." She thought about it for less time than she expected to. 1/4, she said, "and we seal it with a handshake." "That's the only way I seal anything," he said. "What?" The first month was brutal in a way she hadn't fully planned for. Not impossible, but the kind of hard that makes you revise your definition of hard about every 4 days. She built herself a shelter against the surviving section of foundation wall. Not a house, not yet. Just 4 rough posts and a canvas roof weighted down with stones, barely large enough to sleep in if she kept her knees pulled up. She slept on a pile of dried grass covered with an oilcloth and Daniel's wool coat, and told herself it was temporary with a firmness that was mostly about not letting herself think too much about what she'd left behind. Hattie the milk goat adapted immediately. The bamboo's young shoots were apparently exactly as delicious as Marin had theorized. The 4 goats from Orin, he called them nothing but 1, 2, 3, and 4, which told Marin something about his relationship to sentimentality, took a couple of days to adjust, and then set to work with the focused, methodical enthusiasm that goats bring to any destructive task. The clearing went slowly. Marin would cut a path with a heavy brush knife. She'd traded a week's worth of cheese to get a decent one from the hardware man, who at least had the grace to make the trade without commentary, and the goats would follow her through, stripping the cut cane clean of leaves and shoots and pushing further in with their blocky heads. They ate the young bamboo to the ground. They ignored the mature cane, but the lack of leaves and the repeated grazing set it back. By the end of the first 2 weeks, she had cleared a space about 20 feet wide and 30 feet deep, which meant she had approximately 39.5 acres left to go. She did not find this funny at the time. The townspeople came by occasionally, not to help, just to look, the way you drive slowly past an accident, not because you want to see anything terrible, but because the human brain has a reflex toward disaster that it can't always override. She heard the phrase bamboo widow for the first time in the third week, when a pair of young men stopped their horses on the ridge road and watched her work for a few minutes before one of them said it loudly enough to carry. She kept cutting. The work had its own logic once she settled into it. Cut, goats eat, cut further, goats follow. Her hands blistered, and the blisters broke and toughened. Her arms developed a new kind of soreness that moved from her wrists to her shoulders over the first 2 weeks and then seemed to find its permanent address somewhere along her right forearm and stayed there. She learned to read the bamboo, the difference between old established cane that would fight her and new growth that was still soft enough to cut on the upswing. She sold cheese at the market twice a week, walking the 4 miles down the ridge road before dawn with a basket that she filled as she went from Hattie's morning milking. She made enough to buy feed, repair a fence section, and purchase 2 more young goats from a farmer near the county line who asked no questions and took her money without comment. She added a second kid to the herd in the 6th week, then 2 more in the 8th. The goats multiplied with a cheerfulness that stood in sharp contrast to everything else about the situation. And then, on a Thursday morning in the 4th month, in the gray light just after dawn, Tobin Reed appeared at the edge of her clearing. He was 12 years old, or thereabouts, small for his age, thin in the way children get when they're not eating quite enough on a regular enough basis, with a face that had the particular closed-down expression of a kid who has learned early that wanting things visible on your face is just an invitation to disappointment. I was wearing a coat that was 2 sizes too large and boots that were approximately right, but tied with the laces doubled over, which meant they were too short, and he was compensating. He stood at the tree line and watched her work without saying anything for what might have been 10 minutes. "You need something?" she asked, without stopping. "No," he said. She kept cutting. "You're doing it wrong," he said. She stopped, turned around, looked at him. "Is that right?" she said. "If you cut at an angle like that, it splits the cane and makes splinters. Better to cut straight across. The goats can't eat the split ones as good." She looked down at her brush knife, then at the cane. I wasn't wrong. She'd noticed the problem herself and attributed it to blade angle, but hadn't quite worked out the fix. "Where'd you learn that?" she asked. He shrugged with the particular economy of motion of a child who has learned that the word nowhere ends conversations faster than explanations. "You hungry?" she asked. The closed-down expression flickered once, briefly. "Maybe," he said. She had 2 biscuits in her coat pocket, left over from her morning. She held one out without making a thing of it. He crossed the clearing and took it and ate it in 3 bites, which told her the maybe had been generous. "What's your name?" she asked. "Tobin Reed." She nodded. "You want to work?" He looked around the clearing, at the goat stripping cane at the far edge, at the canvas shelter, at the 40 acres of green standing behind everything. His expression was the most honest thing about him. He was calculating something, the way underfed children calculate, weighing work against food against the reliability of the person making the offer. "What's the pay?" he asked. 2 meals a day and everything you earn," she said. It wasn't a great offer, but it was an honest one. Tobin Reed looked at the bamboo. "All right," he said. Well, by the 5th month, with 7 goats and 1 12-year-old boy, Marin had cleared nearly 4 acres. Her hands had stopped hurting in the old way and started not hurting in the new way that meant the nerves had given up complaining and simply adapted. She had added a second room to her shelter, barely, more of a lean-to with 1 solid wall, so that Tobin had somewhere to sleep on the nights when walking back to town before dark wasn't sensible. She didn't ask about his home. She had learned enough about Tobin Reed in 5 months to understand that his home was a subject with no good answers, and that the biscuits and meals and the work were doing what they were supposed to do without any conversation about it needing to happen. It was Tobin who found it. They were cutting in from the western edge on a cold November morning, the goats working ahead of them now because they'd gotten confident enough to push into the cane without Marin breaking trail first. She was widening a channel they'd opened the day before when she heard Tobin stop behind her. "Marin," he said. His voice was different. Not alarmed, something more careful than that. She pushed back through to him. He was standing in front of a section of cane that should have looked like every other section, except that where the goats had stripped the bottom 3 feet of growth, there was something gray and solid beneath. She reached in and pushed the remaining cane aside. Stone. Old stone, dark with age and mold and the pressed weight of decades of vegetation, but solid, not a random fieldstone, shaped, cut, set in a course. She followed it up with her hand, then further up. The cane fought her back. "Get me the rope," she said. Tobin brought it. She tied one end around the base of a thick cane stalk and pulled, and the cane cracked free, and she could see 3, 4, 5 courses of stone rising up. And above that, the bamboo went up in a solid wall, and she couldn't see the top. "Get Orin," she said. Tobin ran. Orin Vale arrived in 40 minutes, moving faster than Marin had seen him move before, and he stood in the opening she'd cut and looked at the stone and didn't say anything for a long time. "That's the chimney," he said finally. "The old house chimney. I heard it was 18 feet. I never thought—" He stopped. Marin looked at the chimney, then at the 40 acres of green still surrounding them. She thought about the orchard she'd heard mentioned: apple, pear, cherry. She thought about the deep well that was supposedly somewhere on the property. She thought about the old barn foundations and the stone-lined root cellar and all the other things that the county tax records had listed once, a long time ago, before everything was described simply as uncultivable. She had bought 40 acres that everyone called worthless. She hadn't bought wilderness. She had bought a buried farm. And underneath all that green, it was waiting. The chimney changed everything, and it changed nothing. That was the strange cruelty of it. Marin stood in that cleared channel with Orin beside her and Tobin back from his run, all three of them looking at 18 feet of old stone rising up through the bamboo like a monument to something that used to exist, and the feeling she had was not triumph. It was closer to vertigo. Because the chimney didn't make the work easier. It didn't clear the remaining 36 acres. It didn't fix the cracked axle on the wagon, or fill the lean-to with food, or put coins in the purse that had been empty since the auction. What it did was prove she hadn't been wrong. And for a woman who had spent the better part of 18 months being told, in a dozen different ways, by a dozen different people, that her judgment was not to be trusted, that was not a small thing. Orin ran his hand along the stone. He was quiet for a long time, the way he was quiet about most things. But this was a different quality of quiet. Less contemplative. More like a man trying to locate something he'd misplaced a long time ago. "My wife used to buy fruit from this orchard," he said finally, "before everything went to pieces. She made a cherry preserves from what they grew here that I have not tasted the equal of in 30 years. He pulled his hand back. "I always wondered if the trees were still alive under all of it." Marin looked at the bamboo surrounding them. "One way to find out," she said. Tobin, who had been listening with the particular attention of a child who has learned that adults say the most useful things when they've temporarily forgotten you're in the room, said, "How far do you think it goes?" "The bamboo? The foundation? The old house?" Marin looked at the chimney, then at the ground around them. The stone foundation wall she'd been using as the anchor for her shelter was on the southern edge. This chimney was somewhere near the center of the property, which meant if the original house had been built the way houses of that era were usually built. "Big," she said. Tobin nodded, like this confirmed something he'd already calculated. "We're going to need more goats," he said. She got more goats the hard way, which was the only way she got anything. Marin's cheese had developed a reputation in Briar Hollow that was by this point running slightly ahead of her reputation as a source of public amusement. The milk from goats feeding almost exclusively on fresh bamboo shoots had a sweetness to it, not cloying but clean and distinct, that turned up in the cheese in a way that people noticed without always being able to name. She had sold her output twice a week at the Saturday market since the beginning, and by the 5th month, 2 of the town's 3 grocers were buying regularly instead of occasionally. She still wasn't making real money, but she was making enough to keep moving. She traded cheese for a young breeding buck from a farmer across the county line. She traded labor, 3 days helping a neighbor family get their hay in before a weather front hit, for 2 more does. She borrowed a fence-building tool from Orin, spent a weekend repairing the section of old post and wire fence that the bamboo had buried but not destroyed, and used the enclosed area to give the growing herd more range without losing track of them. By number, she had 11 goats. 11 goats made a different sound than 5 goats. There was a mass to them now, a collective physical presence that changed the way the clearing felt. They moved through the bamboo's lower reaches with confidence, filing single through the channels. Marin and Tobin cut each day, and the sound of them working, that particular tearing and crunching, the low complaint they made when a stalk was too thick and the satisfaction when it wasn't, became the background music of her days in a way that she found, to her own mild surprise, genuinely comforting. Tobin had also changed, but was still thin, still careful with his words, still had that closed-down expression as his default setting. But there was a competence growing in him that Marin could see accumulating the way a person gains muscle, gradually, in small increments, not always obvious day to day, but unmistakable over time. He had learned to read the goats faster than she had. He knew which ones led, which ones followed, which one, a gray-eared doe Tobin called Martha, without asking Marin's permission, which she chose not to address, was smart enough to be sent ahead into new territory to scout. He had also, quietly, stopped going back to town most nights. Marin didn't ask about that either. She bought an extra blanket. She made sure supper was enough for two. She told herself it was a practical arrangement and did not examine it further than that, because there were only so many large things a person could look at directly in a given week. Christmas came and went without much ceremony. Orin brought a jar of something he'd put up in the fall that turned out to be apple butter, which Marin thought was the most thoughtful gift she'd received in years, partly because it was useful, and partly because he hadn't made any kind of occasion of it. Just set it on the foundation wall and walked away before she could thank him properly. Tobin made her something out of bamboo cane that he said was a hook for hanging things, which it was, though it had clearly started life as an attempt at something more ambitious. She hung it on the shelter wall and used it for her brush knife. January was brutal. Not catastrophically. The ridge was sheltered enough from the worst winds, and the bamboo, whatever else you could say against it, created a windbreak that was genuinely effective. But the cold settled into everything. The ground froze hard. Marin's hands, which had toughened through the fall, cracked again at the knuckles in a way that made mornings particularly miserable. She and Tobin developed a routine of warming their hands over the small stove before going out. A few minutes of standing close to the heat without talking, which became one of those rituals that has no name but is understood by both parties to be necessary. The goats needed more attention in the cold. Their water froze, their shelter required additional bedding. Two of the does came close to a respiratory illness that Marin caught early because Tobin had noticed one of them standing differently and said so at supper with the careful offhandedness of a kid who had learned to present concerns sideways. "Martha's been standing at the fence by herself," he said, spooning broth without looking up. Marin looked at him. "Since when?" "This morning. Maybe yesterday evening, too." She went out with a lantern after supper and found the gray-eared doe with a slight fever and the beginning of a wet cough. She separated her, treated her with the herbs Orin had told her about in the fall, and sat with her for 2 hours in the cold until she was certain it was manageable. It was manageable. But it was close. That night, lying in the shelter with the stove banked down and the cold pressing in from every direction, Marin thought about what a setback would actually mean at this stage. She ran the arithmetic the way she did when she couldn't sleep. Not obsessively, but methodically. The way you inventory a tool chest to make sure nothing's missing. The herd was the engine of everything. Without the herd, no clearing. Without clearing, no farm. Without the farm, no future of any kind that she could see. She was not a person given to panic, but she was also not a person who confused calmness with not understanding the stakes. She understood the stakes exactly. February brought the first real discovery after the chimney, and it came the way most important things came on that ridge. Not dramatically, but quietly, and only because someone was paying close attention. Tobin was leading the goats through a new channel they'd opened on the northern edge when Martha, recovered, opinionated, clearly not grateful, stopped and refused to move. She stood in the channel with her legs planted and her head down in that particular way that meant something beneath the ground was different. "She smells water," Tobin said. Marin looked at the ground. It was frozen still, but there was a slight depression, barely visible, that she hadn't noticed before. "Get the rod," she said. The iron probing rod was a tool Orin had lent her, and she'd never returned because she kept finding uses for it. She pushed it down through the frozen soil in the depression, angling it, feeling for resistance, and at about 18 inches, it went through something and came back up wet. They dug by hand for an hour, Marin and Tobin both, taking turns, until the frozen top layer gave way to darker soil and then to stone. A stone ring, mortared, almost perfectly preserved. The well was 4 feet across, and when Marin dropped a stone in, much deeper than she expected from the sound. She sat back on her heels and looked at Tobin. He was covered in mud and breathing hard and trying not to look as pleased as he was. "That's the old well," he said. "That's the old well," she agreed. She thought about water, about what a reliable water source on this ridge meant for the herd, for a kitchen garden, for everything. The creek at the property's edge ran low in summer. She'd been hauling water for months. A well meant she was no longer dependent on the creek, no longer dependent on rain, no longer at the mercy of the one resource that every farmer in a dry year was at the mercy of. She stood up and looked at the bamboo surrounding them. "What else do you think is under there?" Tobin asked. "Everything," she said. "I think everything is under there." What? She was right, though not all at once, and not without cost. March brought the first real argument she had with Orin, which surprised her because she hadn't known they'd gotten close enough to argue. She had proposed using fire to clear the lowest section of the bamboo near the old well. A controlled burn, carefully managed, to deal with the root systems that the goats couldn't get to, and that regrew with a persistence that made her feel personally antagonized. Orin said no. "You'll lose the well," he said. "The heat will crack the mortar." "Not if we keep it contained." "You can't contain a bamboo fire. I watched them try in '48. Took out a fence line and 6 acres of a man's cornfield before they got it stopped. That was a dry summer." "It's March," he said. "Wind's unpredictable." They went back and forth on it for longer than was comfortable, standing at the well site in the cold with the goats ranging around them, and Tobin making himself very small and busy with a piece of fence wire he'd found, which was the correct strategy. In the end, Marin didn't use fire, partly because Orin was probably right about the mortar, partly because she'd run the logic herself and kept arriving at the same uncertain answer, but also partly because there was something in the act of conceding the point that felt, strangely, like its own kind of strength. She was not always right. She was stubborn enough to know when she was, and stubborn enough to know when she wasn't, and knowing the difference seemed to her like the more valuable version of the two. "We dig the roots by hand," she said. Orin nodded once, satisfied in the way of a man who has made his case and doesn't require additional acknowledgement. "Tobin's arms are young," he said, walking away. "My arms work fine," she said. He didn't answer that. By the time April came in, warm and fast, the way spring comes in the hill country, Marin had 9 cleared acres. 9 acres felt like something. It looked like something too. She could stand at the foundation wall on the south end and see the well on the north end without obstruction, see the chimney between them rising up out of the ground that was still broken and rough but no longer buried, and see, emerging on either side, the ghost of what the original layout of this farm had been. The house had been set on the high ground naturally, the well nearby. The barn, she suspected, had been southeast. There was an area where the soil felt different underfoot, compacted in a way that suggested heavy use for many years, and where the bamboo grew slightly less densely, as if even vegetation had found that ground less inviting. The orchard was harder to locate. She and Tobin spent a Saturday morning moving along the western edge of the cleared area, probing with the iron rod, looking for the particular signs Orin had described. Certain ground depression patterns, changes in soil texture, the way light moved through bamboo canopy where taller trees existed beneath. They found nothing for 2 hours, which was discouraging in the specific way that searching for something you're not entirely sure exists can be discouraging. You begin to question whether you made the whole thing up. Then Tobin stopped and pointed upward. He didn't say anything, just pointed. Marin looked. Above the bamboo, barely visible against the sky, was the bare branch pattern of a large tree. Not bamboo cane, actual branches, hardwood, reaching out horizontally the way fruit trees reach when they're old and established and have had many years to grow toward the light. She pushed into the bamboo toward it. The first tree she found was a pear. She knew it by the bark texture before she could see the buds. An old pear has a particular gray-black bark that looks dead until you scratch it and find green underneath. This tree was alive, not thriving. The bamboo had shaded it for years and it had retreated into a kind of survival mode, sending up its few remaining branches high above the canopy to catch what light it could. But alive. She pressed her palm against the bark and felt the solidity of it, the particular stillness of an old tree that has been through things. "Tobin," she called. He pushed through to her. He looked at the tree, then up at the branches, then back at the tree. "That's old," he said. 20, 30 years at least. Is it going to make fruit? Clear the bamboo around it and give it a season. I don't know." She paused. "But it's not dead." They found 6 more trees that afternoon. 2 pears, 3 apples, 1 cherry that was the most overgrown of all of them and the most alive. Its root system had apparently been deep and stubborn enough to keep it in active growth even without direct sunlight. And when Marin cleared the cane from around its base, she found small sucker growth coming up from the roots that was fresh and green and absolutely unmistakable. She sat down in the mud next to the cherry tree and just stayed there for a moment. Not crying. She was too tired for that, and not given to it much anyway. Just staying. Tobin sat down next to her without being asked. "Orin said his wife used to buy cherry preserves from this orchard," Marin said. "I know, you told me." She hadn't realized she'd told him. "What do you think? Can we save them?" Tobin looked at the tree with the particular evaluative expression he'd developed, chin slightly down, eyes slightly narrow, that she'd come to recognize as him actually thinking rather than just generating a response. "We'll need to prune back the dead wood, open up the canopy, give them water from the well once we've got it properly cleaned." He paused. "It'll take at least a full growing season before you know what you've got." She looked at him. "When did you learn about pruning fruit trees?" she asked. He shrugged. "Orin." Orin, who came by twice a week, and apparently used some of that time to teach Tobin things he hadn't gotten around to teaching Marin yet. She filed that away without irritation. Orin's teaching methods were his own business. The results were standing next to her and correctly analyzing a fruit tree's recovery prospects, so she wasn't inclined to complain. The town's attitude toward her was a complicated thing that she tried not to spend too much energy on. There were people who had been openly unkind at the auction and were now openly uncertain. They watched her sell cheese at the market with the particular expression of someone revising a calculation they'd been confident about and finding the new answer uncomfortable. There were people who had simply ignored her existence before and continued to ignore it, which was neutral in a way she found almost restful. There were a handful who had quietly become regulars at her market table, who brought their own containers now because they knew she'd have inventory, who did not apologize for having doubted her, but who communicated something like respect through the simple act of showing up consistently. And then there was Harrison Webb. The banker's attitude toward Marin had evolved from pity to puzzlement to a kind of wary acknowledgement that she had not in fact destroyed herself with the auction purchase. He had not offered her credit again. But he had stopped shaking his head when she came into the bank to deposit her weekly earnings, which she counted as progress. The one person whose attention genuinely unsettled her was someone she hadn't met yet. She began noticing things in April. Small things, the kind that are easy to dismiss individually but accumulate into a pattern. A set of fresh boot prints at the edge of the ridge road near her property line, in a spot where the road curved away from the farm and a man standing in the ditch could look down over the cleared area without being easily seen. A section of old fence wire on the eastern boundary that had been folded back and then carefully replaced. Not by her, not by Tobin, and Orin hadn't been out that way. She mentioned it to Orin on his next visit. He was quiet for a moment. "Could be curiosity," he said. "Could be." "People are talking more," he said, "about what you found up here. The well, the orchard. Word gets around." "I know." "Some of that talk might have gotten to people who have an interest in being interested." She looked at him. "What people?" Orin looked at the chimney, which they could now see clearly from where they stood, 18 feet of old stone against a blue April sky. "The Crown family sold this land to the county for taxes and got almost nothing," he said slowly. "That was 15 years ago. If someone in that family is now looking down the ridge road and seeing a well and a fruit orchard and a growing herd of goats." He paused. "People who let something go regret it a lot harder once they see what it could have been." Marin thought about that. "Can they do anything?" she asked. "Legally. The auction was county-run. The deed is recorded." "I don't know," Orin said. "I'm a farmer, not a lawyer." The boot prints came back the following Thursday. Same spot. This time there were 2 sets. Marin mentioned nothing of it to Tobin. He was 12 years old, and the farm was already the most stable thing in his life, and she saw no reason to introduce a threat that might not materialize into something real. But she started keeping the deed folded in the front pocket of her coat rather than in the tin box in the shelter where she'd been keeping it, just as a habit. May was the month the herd crossed 20. 22 goats, technically. 3 new kids born in the last weeks of April, which Tobin had managed almost entirely on his own because Marin had been sick for 4 days with something that settled in her chest and refused to leave without a fight. She had spent 2 of those days insisting she was fine and working at about 40% capacity, which Orin had observed without comment, and Tobin had addressed by appearing each morning with a tin cup of broth that neither of them discussed the provenance of. On the day she felt genuinely well again, not just functional, but actually well, with her full energy back and her chest clear, she walked the whole perimeter of the cleared area for the first time without stopping to work. Just walked it, looked at it. 12 acres now, nearly. The chimney at the center, the well on the north side, cleaned and lined and producing water that was cold and clean, even in the warmest afternoon. The orchard trees, 7 of them confirmed alive, 2 more probable, opened up and pruned back to where they could breathe, the cherry tree already pushing small buds from the newly unshaded wood. The barn foundation on the southeast had been fully exposed and turned out to be solid stone, 3 courses high, exactly the right size for the herd shelter she needed to build before next winter. And behind all of it, still, 30 more acres of bamboo. She stood at the clearing edge and looked at the wall of green and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not dread, not exhaustion, not even the grim determination that had been carrying her since October. Something that was almost impatience. She wanted to see what was underneath. She went back to work. The cheese order came in June, and it changed the math in a way that Marin had to sit down and work through twice before she trusted the numbers. A man named Collier, who owned a restaurant in the city, 2 days' travel east, the kind of establishment that served food on real china and had wine from France on the menu, had apparently been buying her cheese from one of the Briar Hollow grocers for the past 2 months. He sent a letter, then sent himself, arriving on a Thursday afternoon in a good coat that he didn't seem particularly worried about getting muddy. He stood in the cleared area, looked around at the herd moving through the bamboo edge, looked at the chimney, looked at the partially exposed barn foundation and said, "This is extraordinary," in a tone that was genuinely meant and not at all condescending, which Marin appreciated. "It's a working farm," she said. "I can see that." He looked at the goats. "How many are you running?" 22 now." He nodded slowly, clearly calculating. "I want everything you can produce," he said. "Full inventory, first right of refusal. I'll pay above market and collect on a monthly basis." Marin looked at him. "Everything?" she said. "Every wheel, every log, every fresh batch? My dining room has a certain clientele. They've been asking specifically for this cheese since the summer menu went in. I need reliable supply." She made herself take a breath before she answered. The instinct was to say yes immediately, and she'd learned to distrust that instinct because it was the instinct of a person who was used to scarcity. She had a different calculation to make now. "I can give you 60%, she said. "The rest stays local." He frowned slightly. "That's not what I have people here who buy from me every week. Families who've been consistent since I started. I'm not cutting them off for a bigger order." She kept her voice level. 60%. First right of refusal within that 60. Collier looked at her for a moment with an expression that was recalibrating. 65, he said. 60, she said. "I told you the number." He smiled then, which she hadn't expected. It was a real smile, not a negotiating expression. 60%, he said. "Agreed. And if you expand the herd?" "When I expand the herd," she said, "we'll have this conversation again." They shook hands in the cleared area with the chimney behind her and the bamboo rustling in the afternoon wind, and Tobin watched from the edge of the barn foundation with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral and not quite managing it. After Collier left, Tobin said, "You could have taken 65. "I know," Marin said. "Why didn't you?" She thought about it. "Because the moment you let someone think they can move your number," she said, "they'll keep trying to move your number. Better to hold it the first time." Tobin was quiet. "Also," she said, "I meant what I said about the local buyers." "I know you did," he said. "That's not the part I was asking about." She looked at him. He was 13 now, or close to it, and the face that had been so carefully closed down when she'd first seen him was still careful, still watchful, but there was something opening in it that she noticed sometimes in unguarded moments, a kind of attention that was not defensive but genuinely curious about how things worked and why people made the choices they made. She thought about the best way to explain what she'd actually been thinking and decided that the full truth was appropriate. Because the first time someone offers you exactly what you thought you wanted, she said, and you don't immediately take it, that tells you something about yourself and about them. What did it tell you? That I want to be here, she said. Not just surviving here, actually here, with the herd and the orchard and the well and the people I've been selling cheese to for a year. She paused. And that he was willing to pay it. Tobin nodded slowly. He didn't even argue, Tobin said. No, she agreed. He didn't. Neither of them said what that meant. That the cheese was worth more than Collier had initially pretended, that the farm was worth more than either of them had said out loud, that the 40 acres that everyone had dismissed at a county auction on an October morning were developing, slowly and stubbornly, into something that people were starting to want a piece of. The boot prints appeared again that evening, in the ditch by the eastern fence. This time, whoever had made them had stayed long enough to smoke a cigarette. Marin found the stub when she walked the perimeter before supper. She picked it up and turned it in her fingers. Then she put it in her coat pocket next to the deed, and went inside. The cigarette stub sat on the shelf above the stove for 2 weeks before Marin threw it out. She wasn't sure why she kept it that long. It wasn't evidence of anything specific. A man standing in a ditch smoking wasn't a crime, and the Ridge Road was public, and anyone had the right to stand where they liked and look at whatever they could see. But it bothered her the way a sound bothers you in the middle of the night. Not loud enough to justify getting up, but persistent enough that you can't quite settle back into sleep. Someone was paying attention to this farm. Someone had been paying attention for months. And the attention had a quality to it that she couldn't name but could feel, the way you feel a change in barometric pressure before the actual weather arrives. She didn't mention it to Tobin. She'd made that decision back in April and saw no reason to revisit it. She did mention it to Orin on a warm Tuesday in late June when he came up the Ridge Road with a bundle of old fence posts he'd pulled from his own property and offered without preamble, the way he offered everything, as a fact rather than a gesture. The watching is still happening, she said. Orin set the fence posts against the barn foundation. I heard something in town, he said, not immediately. What kind of something? He straightened up slowly, the way a man of 73 straightens when he's been carrying weight. Silas Crown was at the county offices 2 weeks ago, asking questions about the Parcel 47 auction. Marin was quiet for a moment. Silas Crown, she said. That's the grandson. The only one still in the county. He's the tax assessor now, has been for 6 years. She turned that over, the tax assessor. The man whose office had been responsible for valuing the property, declaring it uncultivable, and scheduling the auction in the first place. What kind of questions? She asked. Don't know exactly. My source is Petty, the auctioneer, and Petty doesn't always get the details right. He just gets the fact of a thing. Orin looked at the chimney. But Petty said Crown had papers with him, old papers, a survey of some kind. Marin said nothing. It may be nothing, Orin said, which was not something he usually said, which told her he thought it was probably not nothing. She nodded and went back to work. And for the rest of that day she cut bamboo with a little more force than strictly necessary, and the goats followed behind her with their usual cheerful indifference to her emotional state, which she found both irritating and useful. Silas Crown arrived on a Monday morning in early July. She heard the carriage before she saw it, the particular sound of good wheels on the Ridge Road, the kind of vehicle that was maintained rather than just used, with a horse that moved at a confident pace rather than the careful negotiation of a working animal. She was at the well when she heard it, drawing water for the midday herd check, and she straightened up and looked toward the road. The carriage was black and clean in the way that things are clean when someone else is responsible for cleaning them. The man who climbed out of it was somewhere in his mid-40s, lean in an indoor way, dressed in a coat that was too good for a Monday morning visit to a ridge farm, and wearing it with the ease of someone who had stopped noticing the quality of his own clothes a long time ago. He had a thin face with a mouth that seemed set at a slight downward angle, as though the default expression was assessment, and the assessment was rarely favorable. He stood at the edge of the cleared area and looked around with the unhurried attention of a man who has decided he's not in a hurry. Tobin appeared at Marin's elbow from somewhere. He had a way of materializing when things felt off, which she had noticed before and was grateful for now. "You know who that is?" he said quietly. "I think so," she said. She walked toward the man. Not quickly, not slowly. At the pace of a person on their own property who has not been informed that they should feel any particular way about a visitor. "Mrs. Kestrel," the man said. "That's right," she said. "And you are?" "Silas Crown." He said it the way people say a name they expect to land with weight. "My family owned this property for 3 generations. "I know who you are," she said. "What can I do for you?" Something moved in his expression. Not quite annoyance, but the precursor to it. He wasn't accustomed to people skipping the part where they registered the significance of his name. "I wanted to see the property," he said. "I have to say, I'm impressed by what you've managed." He looked around the clearing again, and the look was one she recognized, the look of someone calculating value while performing admiration. "Quite remarkable, for the amount of time and with the resources available to you." "It's a working farm," she said. The same thing she'd said to Collier, in a completely different tone. "Indeed." He reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope. "I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Kestrel. I've been made aware of some irregularities in the auction process that concerned me enough to investigate." She didn't reach for the envelope. "What irregularities?" "The survey on record for Parcel 47 is from 1887. There's a question about whether the legal description accurately captures the boundaries." He paused, letting that settle. "If the boundaries were incorrectly described in the auction notice, the sale may not have been legally valid." Marin looked at him. She thought about the boot prints, the cigarette stub, the questions at the county offices. She thought about the timeline. October auction, November discovery of the chimney, April orchard confirmed alive, June cheese contract with Collier. And she thought about how a man with access to county records and 6 years as tax assessor would have had no trouble watching that timeline develop from a safe distance. "The sale was conducted by the county," she said. "The notice was published 3 times. I have the deed, recorded and certified." "Yes," he said, "and that may well hold up." He extended the envelope. "Which is why I want to be straightforward with you. I'm prepared to offer you $200 for the property, cash, today." $200 was, she did the math instantly, approximately 2.5 times what she'd paid. It was more money than she had seen at one time in her adult life. It was enough to rent a decent house in town for 3 years. It was enough to start something else, something safer, something that didn't involve sleeping in a canvas shelter on a ridge in January. "No," she said. He blinked. It was a small blink, but she caught it. "Mrs. Kestrel, I want to be fair to you. The legal question about the survey is a question you'd have to answer in court," she said. "Not on my property on a Monday morning." She kept her voice exactly level. "I have work to do. Is there anything else?" He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was recalibrating in a direction she didn't entirely like. "A woman in your position," he said, and his tone had changed, gentled in a way that was not gentleness, managing a property this size alone, without legal representation, without the kind of resources needed for a prolonged dispute. "I want to make sure you understand what you'd be taking on." "I understand it," she said. "I don't think you do." He said it quietly, almost kindly, which was worse than if he'd said it coldly. Legal challenges of this type can take years. They are expensive. They require documentation and witnesses and an understanding of property law that most people don't have. And in the meantime, depending on how the county proceeds, there could be questions about the validity of your operations here, your right to sell. "Are you threatening me?" she said. "I'm informing you," he said. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Crown," she said, "your family left this land. They let the taxes go. They let the county take it. They were not here when it was buried under 12 feet of bamboo, and everyone in Briar Hollow thought it was worthless. And they are not here now because it is worth something." She paused. "I bought it at a legal auction with legal money, and I have the legal deed in my pocket. If you have a legal challenge, take it to a legal proceeding. But don't come to my farm and call it a courtesy." His mouth thinned. "I'll be in touch," he said. He walked back to the carriage without hurrying, which was a deliberate thing, a thing meant to communicate that he was a man who moved at his own pace regardless of what anyone else said. He climbed in, and the carriage turned on the ridge road and went back the way it came. Tobin appeared at her shoulder. "How much did he offer?" he asked. 200. Tobin whistled low, which she'd never heard him do before. "That's a lot," he said. "It is," she said, "but the farm is worth more." She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "It is." She had not lied to Silas Crown about having the deed in her pocket. She'd started carrying it there after the first boot prints appeared, and she carried it still, folded in oilcloth against the sweat and weather. But having the deed and knowing what to do with it were two different things, and she spent the 3 days after Crown's visit turning the problem over with the same methodical attention she gave to every problem that didn't have an obvious answer. She couldn't afford a lawyer. That was simply true. Collier's contract had improved her position significantly, but not enough to sustain a prolonged legal battle, and she was under no illusions about what Silas Crown's resources looked like compared to her own. What she had was the deed, the public auction record, and the fact that Crown himself had been the county tax assessor when the property was assessed, condemned, and scheduled for sale. That last part kept coming back to her. On the 4th day after his visit, she walked to Orin's farm in the evening and sat at his kitchen table and told him what she was thinking. Orin listened without interrupting, which he was good at. "If Crown signed off on the assessment," she said, "if his name is on the documents declaring the property uncultivable and authorizing the auction, then a legal challenge from him has a particular problem. He'd be challenging an action he himself authorized," Orin said. "More than that, he'd be saying the auction was illegal while his own signature is on the paperwork that made it happen." She spread her hands on the table. "That's not a legal challenge. That's a conflict of interest at minimum. At worst, it's an abuse of his office." Orin was quiet. "The county archives," he said. "Yes. You'd need the original assessment documents, the auction authorization, everything with his name on it." "I know." She paused. "Can I get them? As a property owner of record?" "Public records are public," Orin said slowly. "In theory. In practice, the county clerk's office is... The clerk is a man named Foster, and Foster and Crown have been friendly for a long time." "How friendly?" "Hunting together friendly. The kind of friendly that means a request for inconvenient records might get lost under a pile of other paperwork." Marin thought about that. "Then I don't make the request through normal channels," she said. Orin looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The archive room is public. Anyone can go in and look at historical records. I don't have to ask Foster for anything specific. I just need to know where to look." She met his eyes. "Do you know anyone at the courthouse who isn't friendly with Crown?" Orin was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that meant he was going through a catalog of people in his head and checking each one against a set of criteria. "Maggie Tull," he said finally. "She clerks for the county recorder's office, separate from Foster's operation. She's been there 22 years and she doesn't like Crown." "Why not?" "Because 6 years ago, when Crown was getting the assessor position, he implied in a public meeting that the recorder's office had made errors in some property descriptions and that a review might be warranted." Orin's expression was dry. "Maggie Tull does not forget implications." Marin nodded. "Tell me how to find the archive room," she said. "Bota." She went on a Wednesday, because Wednesday morning was when the courthouse was least busy. She'd established this through the simple method of having been to the courthouse on various days for various reasons over the past year and paying attention. She brought Tobin because he was faster at reading handwriting than she was, a skill he'd apparently developed through means she still hadn't fully investigated and which she had decided fell into the same category as his sleeping arrangements before the farm. Things with no good answers that were better addressed through biscuits and work than through conversation. Maggie Tull was a compact woman in her late 50s with the posture of someone who had spent decades defending desk space and the expression of someone who categorized every person who walked through her door in the first 5 seconds and filed them permanently under that initial assessment. She looked at Marin for those 5 seconds. "Orin Vale sent you," she said. It was not a question. "He mentioned you might be able to point me toward the historical property assessment records," Marin said. "Parcel 47, former Crown Estate." Maggie Tull's expression did something small and complex. "Assessment records for that parcel would go back to at least 1895, she said. "The more recent ones, the last 15 years, would be in the assessor's archive, which is technically Foster's jurisdiction. She paused, a pause with architecture in it. However, the original property records, including the county survey files and the historical assessment chain, are maintained here, in the recorder's archive, as they've always been. I'd like to look at them, Marin said. Of course, Maggie Tull said. Public records are public. Follow me. She led them through a door behind the main counter and down a short hallway to a room that smelled like old paper and lamp oil and the particular dryness of documents that had not been disturbed recently. There were shelves from floor to ceiling on 3 walls and a large wooden table in the center with 2 chairs. I'll pull the parcel file, Maggie said. It may take a few minutes. She was gone for 12 minutes. Marin counted. When she came back, she carried a cloth-bound ledger and 2 folders of loose documents, one of them quite thick. She set them on the table without comment and went back to her desk. Marin sat down. Tobin sat beside her. They went through the documents carefully. The oldest materials, survey records, original property descriptions, historical assessment chains, were straightforward and told her nothing she didn't already know about the property's legal history. What she was looking for was more recent. She found it in the second folder, near the bottom. A formal assessment document dated 9 years ago, bearing the stamp of the county assessor's office. The property description was thorough and clinical: 40 acres, ridge location, uncultivable due to invasive vegetation, no accessible improvements, recommended for minimum valuation. At the bottom, a signature line: Silas Crown, County Assessor. She turned the page. A follow-up document dated 7 years ago. A second assessment confirming the first, with a notation that no tax payment had been received for the preceding 3 years and recommending the property be placed on the delinquency schedule. Redemption period noted as 60 days, signed Silas Crown. She turned the page again. A memo from the assessor's office to the county tax committee, dated 6 years ago. Subject Parcel 47, Delinquent Property Disposal. The memo recommended immediate scheduling for county auction, noted that no redemption payment had been received within the statutory period, and stated that the property had been personally reviewed and confirmed as having no recoverable value. Signed, Silas Crown. And at the bottom of that memo, handwritten, a single additional line: no heir notification required as current family address unknown. Property to proceed to public auction. Marin read that line twice. She thought about what that meant. If the Crown family had been notified of the delinquency and the pending auction, if they'd been given the legal opportunity to redeem the property by paying the back taxes, they might have done so. They might not have. But the memo said no notification had been attempted because the address was unknown. A tax assessor who signed the condemnation, recommended the auction, waived the heir notification requirement, and was now claiming the auction was irregular. She put the document down on the table. Tobin had been reading over her shoulder. He said nothing for a moment. He didn't notify his own family, he said, finally. No, she said. That's... He stopped. Yes, she said. She asked Maggie Tull, on the way out, whether certified copies of specific documents could be requested through the recorder's office. Maggie Tull looked at her with the expression of a woman who had been waiting for exactly this question. Certified copies of any public record are available upon written request, she said. Standard fee is 5 cents per page. Copies are typically ready within 2 business days. She paused. Although for requests that are time-sensitive, I sometimes manage same-day processing. I'll need same-day, Marin said. I thought you might, Maggie said. What? The hearing was Crown's idea and his mistake simultaneously. He had apparently decided, Marin would understand this later when she had more of the picture, that a public proceeding would embarrass her into settling before it reached a real legal challenge. He had connections on the county committee. He had the aura of a man accustomed to public rooms going the way he expected them to go. And he had, she imagined, underestimated her consistently enough that the pattern had started to feel like a law of nature. The notice arrived by messenger on a Thursday. A county committee hearing on the validity of the Parcel 47 auction scheduled for the following Tuesday. It was framed as a routine inquiry. The messenger, a young man who clearly knew nothing about the contents of what he was carrying, handed it to her with the blank efficiency of someone delivering invoices. She read it standing in the clearing with the goats moving around her and the summer heat coming down through the bamboo edge and the chimney standing behind her the way it always stood, solid and patient and completely indifferent to human drama. She thought about fear for a moment, actually tried to locate it, the way you probe a sore tooth with your tongue to gauge how bad it is. She found something. It wasn't quite fear. It was closer to the feeling she'd had at the auction, that cold hands feeling of standing at the edge of a thing from which there was no easy retreat. She folded the notice and put it in her coat. Then she went back to work. She spent Friday and Saturday at the county archive, systematically going through every document that bore Crown's signature and the Parcel 47 designation. Tobin was beside her both days, tracking page numbers, noting discrepancies, developing a handwriting recognition for Crown's signature that was faster than Marin's by the second afternoon. On Saturday afternoon, Tobin found the piece that completed the picture. It was a correspondence file, misfiled under a different parcel number, whether accidentally or not, Marin couldn't know, and chose not to speculate about, that contained a letter from a Crown family attorney dated 8 years ago, addressed to the county assessor's office. The letter inquired about the status of the Parcel 47 property and asked specifically whether any delinquency proceedings were pending. The letter was stamped received. It had a response notation in the margin. Replied, no current proceedings. Crown had told the family's own attorney there were no proceedings. 2 years later, he'd signed the memo waiving heir notification because the family address was unknown. Tobin put the letter down on the table. He lied to the lawyer, he said. He lied to the lawyer, Marin confirmed. Tobin looked at her. Can he do that? As a public official? No, she said. He cannot. She had Maggie Toll certify copies of everything. The assessment documents, the memo waiving notification, the attorney correspondence, the response notation, every page with Crown's signature. 31 pages at 5 cents each, $1.55, which was real money, and she paid it without hesitation. The hearing room at the courthouse held maybe 60 people, if you arranged them without much consideration for comfort, and by Tuesday morning it held approximately 58, because whatever Silas Crown had expected this proceeding to be, the town of Briar Hollow had decided it was something else. They came the way towns always come to things that feel important and unresolved. Not entirely sure which side they were on, but certain they wanted to see what happened. Marin sat at a table on one side. Crown sat at a table on the other side with a lawyer from the city whose coat was even better than Crown's, which she noted without particular feeling. Orin was in the third row. Tobin was behind Marin, too young to sit at the table, but close enough that she could hear him breathing, which she found, to her own mild surprise, steadying. The committee chairman was a man named Aldrich, who had the harried expression of someone who had been handed a situation more complicated than his Monday morning had suggested. He read the procedural statement in a flat voice and asked Crown's attorney to present the challenge. The attorney was skilled. Marin gave him that. He laid out the survey discrepancy argument clearly, used the correct technical language, cited the correct statutes. He was measured and unhurried and gave no indication that he was aware of anything Marin might have found in the archive. When he finished, Aldrich looked at Marin. Mrs. Kestrel, he said, with the slightly apologetic tone of a man who suspects the proceeding is not going to end the way it was supposed to. Do you have a response? I do, she said. She stood up. She had rehearsed this, not as a speech, but as a sequence of facts, each one following from the last, each one documented. She set the certified copies on the table in front of her in the order she intended to use them. The county auction notice for Parcel 47 was published according to statute, she said. The auction was conducted by the county auctioneer, Mr. Petty, who is present today. She paused. Petty, she knew, was in the back row. She did not look at him. The deed was recorded and certified. I've held it for 9 months without any dispute being raised until this month. She picked up the first document. The assessment declaring this property uncultivable and recommending minimum valuation was signed by the current county tax assessor, Silas Crown, 9 years ago. She set it on the committee table. The follow-up assessment confirming that valuation and initiating delinquency proceedings was signed by Silas Crown 7 years ago. She set the second document down. The memo recommending immediate auction and waiving heir notification, on the grounds that the family's current address was unknown, was signed by Silas Crown 6 years ago. Third document. The room was very quiet. And this, she said, setting down the fourth document, is a letter from the Crown family's own attorney dated 8 years ago, inquiring about the status of the property. It is stamped received by the assessor's office. The handwritten notation in the margin indicates a reply was sent stating that no proceedings were currently pending. She looked at Silas Crown. I was looking at the documents on the table. His face had not changed expression, which was itself a kind of expression. If the auction was irregular, Marin said, then the assessment that authorized it was irregular. The delinquency determination was irregular. The heir notification waiver was irregular. Every step of this process bears the signature of the man now claiming the process was flawed. She stopped. And 8 years ago, when the family's attorney asked directly whether proceedings were pending, someone in that office told them no. She sat down. The room stayed quiet for a moment. Then someone in the back, she never found out who, said something under their breath that she couldn't quite make out, and the person beside them responded, and the sound spread through the room the way sounds spread through rooms when something has just shifted. Crown's attorney asked for a recess. Aldrich granted 10 minutes. During those 10 minutes, Marin sat at her table and looked at her hands, and Tobin put a cup of water in front of her that she hadn't asked for, which she drank. When Aldrich called the room back to order, his expression had changed. The harried quality was gone. He looked instead like a man who had made a decision and was clear about it. He dismissed the challenge. He did it in careful procedural language that left no room for appeal. The auction had followed statute. The deed was valid. The challenge was without legal foundation. And then, in the same measured tone, he said that the committee would be referring certain matters related to the assessor's office and the handling of Parcel 47 to the county solicitor for review. Silas Crown stood up from his table. He looked at Marin for a moment, a long moment, the kind that has something in it beyond the immediate situation, something that will have consequences in directions not yet visible. Then he walked out. His lawyer followed. The room erupted. Not loudly. People in Briar Hollow didn't typically erupt loudly, but there was a sound, conversation and movement, and the particular kind of noise that a room makes when a lot of people are revising what they thought they knew about a situation. Orin found her at the table. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "Good. That's all you've got?" she said. "You didn't raise your voice," he said. "Not once." "I noticed that," she said. "He was counting on you too," Orin said. "He was counting on a lot of things that didn't happen." She nodded and gathered her certified copies back into their folder because they were hers, and she had paid $1.55 for them, and she intended to keep them forever. Tobin was standing by the door, and when she reached him, he looked at her with that careful, open expression that was becoming more common on his face the older he got. "You knew he'd show his hand," Tobin said. "When you told him to take it to a legal proceeding, you knew he'd do this." "I thought he might," she said. "Why?" She thought about how to explain it. About men who were accustomed to winning in rooms, who trusted rooms to go the way they expected, who confused the performance of authority with the substance of it. "Because he offered me $200, she said. "And when I said no, he didn't ask why. He just moved to the next play." She pushed open the courthouse door into the afternoon. A man who understood what he was dealing with would have asked why. Tobin followed her out into the light. The ridge road was a mile away. The farm was at the end of it. The herd would need the evening check, and the cherry tree was leafing out in a way that Tobin had said 2 days ago needed attention. And there were fence sections on the eastern boundary that she'd been putting off because there were always more urgent things. She started walking. The county solicitor's investigation into Silas Crown's conduct took 4 months, which was faster than anyone expected, and slower than felt tolerable when you were the person who had triggered it. Marin heard about its progress the same way she heard about most things involving the courthouse, through Orin, who heard from Maggie Tull, who did not gossip, but who believed in the accurate circulation of relevant public information, which was a distinction she maintained with great precision. What Maggie communicated at intervals was this. The solicitor had found the attorney correspondence. The solicitor had found 2 additional properties where similar notification waivers had been filed under questionable circumstances. The solicitor had also found something that had not come up in the hearing, a private transaction dated 4 years ago in which Crown had purchased a parcel of land adjacent to a property he had recently assessed at below market value, the seller having been unaware of the disparity. When Orin relayed this last piece, sitting at Marin's table in the rebuilt stone house, she had spent the summer constructing it around the old chimney, which now stood at the center of the kitchen, the way an old tree stands in the middle of a field that's been cleared around it. He delivered the information with the flatness of a man describing weather. "He's done," Orin said. Marin was pressing cheese at the table. She didn't look up. "When?" she asked. "End of the year, maybe sooner. The committee has enough. They're waiting on the solicitor's formal report." She pressed the mold down and wiped her hands on her work cloth. "Good," she said. She meant it, but not in the way she might have meant it 6 months ago, when Crown had stood in her clearing in his good coat and offered her $200 and looked at her farm. The way a person looks at something they've already decided belongs to them. The anger had been real then. Now it had processed down into something more like the conclusion of a mathematical problem, a satisfying correct answer that you don't need to revisit because it's already solved. What she was thinking about now was not Silas Crown. What she was thinking about, with increasing urgency, was water. It had not rained properly in 6 weeks. The summer had started normally enough. Wet in May, which was usual, dry in June, which was expected, scattered thunderstorms in early July that kept the pasture grass green and the well level and the creek running at its usual summer pace. Then the storms stopped. Late July came in hot and stayed hot, the kind of heat that settled onto the ridge like a physical weight and didn't lift at night the way heat is supposed to. August was worse. The creek dropped. The grass turned. Marin noticed it first in the goats. They were eating differently, less enthusiastically in the afternoons, drinking more at the well, seeking shade in ways that went beyond normal summer behavior. The bamboo was holding up, its deep root systems pulling moisture from layers of soil that the surface grasses couldn't reach. But the bamboo coverage was finite now. She had 22 cleared acres, nearly 23, and on those cleared acres the ground was showing stress, the same way the surrounding farms were showing stress. The kitchen garden she'd planted in the spring along the south foundation wall was producing but needed hand-watering twice a day, which took time she felt in every other part of her schedule. "It's going to get worse," Tobin said one morning in late August, looking south from the Ridge Road. He could see 3 farms from up here, Orin's, the Holt property, and a larger operation called Birchfield that ran cattle across 200 acres of bottomland. All 3 showed the same yellowing that meant the hay harvest was going to be short. "I know," Marin said. "How much water does the well have?" She didn't know the exact answer to that. She knew the well was deep, 28 feet to the water table, which was deep for the region. She knew the water level had dropped about 3 feet over the summer, which was within normal range for a dry August, but was worth watching. She knew that the soil under her cleared acres, packed with decades of decomposed bamboo, held moisture longer than standard agricultural ground. She had noticed this in the spring planting. The kitchen garden needed less water than she'd expected. The orchard trees recovered from dry spells faster than their pruning damage suggested they should. What she didn't know was how long any of that would last against a real drought. "We reduced the herd water rotation," she said. "Everyone to the well twice a day on a schedule instead of ad hoc. Cuts the total draw." Tobin nodded. "And the kitchen garden?" "Morning only. The ground holds enough overnight that evening watering is redundant." "What about the orchard trees?" She thought about the orchard trees. 7 of them confirmed alive, 2 more probable, all of them recovering from years of bamboo shade and root competition. They were not robust. A severe drought could set them back badly, possibly fatally. The cherry tree, which had seemed the most vigorous through the spring, had slowed down noticeably in August. "Orchard gets priority after the herd," she said. "I'll redirect the gray water from the cheese press." Tobin made the expression that meant he was running the arithmetic. "That's not enough." "I know it's not enough," she said. "It buys time." September was when the valley understood it was in trouble. The creek at the bottom of the Ridge Road went from low to a trickle to, in the last week of the month, a series of disconnected pools separated by dry gravel beds. That had not happened within living memory, or at least not within the memory of anyone Marin talked to. Orin, who was 73 and had farmed the same ridge for 41 years, stood at the spot where the crossing had been and looked at the dry gravel with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not alarm, but a kind of sober reckoning, the expression of a man updating a calculation he'd thought was settled. "My grandfather talked about a year like this," he said. 1891. Before my time. "What happened?" "They lost cattle, lost the winter wheat. 3 families left the county. He paused. It broke one man entirely. He'd put everything into a new barn that year and had nothing left when the harvest failed. He turned away from the dry gravel. We got through it. Took 2 years. Marin looked at the gravel. The valley's going to need food, she said. It wasn't a question. It was just a fact arriving slightly ahead of the evidence. Yes, Orin said. She went back up the ridge and stood at the cleared area's edge and did the calculation she'd been refusing to do for 2 weeks because the implications were large and she wasn't ready. The herd, 31 goats now, 5 does in milk, the rest ranging through the remaining bamboo, was producing more than enough cheese for Collier's 60% order and the local market combined. The orchard was stressed but alive, and the cherry and one of the pear trees had actually produced modest fruit in their first recovering season. Not a real harvest, but proof of capacity. The kitchen garden had squash and root vegetables in the ground that were, against all reasonable expectation, doing reasonably well because the bamboo composted soil held its moisture 3 days longer than the bottomland fields. Marin had seen drying out when she went to town. She had something no one else in the valley had. A working, water-sourced, moisture-retaining, producing farm. She understood, standing at the clearing edge with the afternoon heat pressing down and the bamboo rustling behind her and the herd moving slowly through the far section, exactly what that meant. And she also understood, with the clarity that comes sometimes when you've been poor enough for long enough to understand what scarcity actually does to people, what choices she could make with it. Collier's messenger arrived the first week of October. It was a different messenger than usual, not the young man who'd become a familiar face over the summer, but an older man and a better horse, which told Marin something before she opened the letter. The offer was substantially above what Collier had been paying. It was in fact more than she'd made in the entire previous 12 months combined. He wanted everything: full production, exclusive contract, city delivery. He cited the drought, the scarcity of quality product, the specific requests of his clientele. She read the letter at the kitchen table, in the stone house built around the old chimney, with the fire going for the first time since spring, because the September nights had turned cold fast, the way they do in drought years when the soil has no stored warmth. Tobin read it over her shoulder. "That's," he started. "Yes," she said. "You'd be set," he said. "For years, probably." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "But," she set the letter down. "But nothing," she said. "I'm saying no to the exclusive." Tobin pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He was 14 now, nearly, and the careful arithmetic he'd been doing in his head since she'd first given him a biscuit in the clearing had developed into something more sophisticated. An actual understanding of how things connected to other things, how a decision made in one place created conditions in another. She had watched it grow the way she'd watched the orchard trees grow, gradually, without announcement, until one day it was simply there. "Walk me through it," he said. "The valley is going to be hungry by December," she said. "Maybe before. The bottomland farms are losing their hay. The cattle operations can't feed what they're running. Winter wheat didn't go in properly because of the August heat. Come November, people are going to be looking for food and not finding it." She paused. "I have food. I have milk and cheese and the garden and the orchard, and I have the only reliable water source on this ridge. If I sell everything to Collier, the people here go without while his dining room stays stocked." Tobin looked at the letter. "He's offering a lot of money," he said. "He is. And you built this farm. You did the work. Nobody helped you for the first—" "Orin helped me," she said. "And you. And Maggie Tull. And the people who kept buying cheese when everyone was laughing." She shook her head. "I'm not interested in scoring the ledger. I'm interested in what I can actually live with." He was quiet again. Then, "What are you going to do about people who can't pay?" "Sell on credit, repayable after the drought ends. Work trade if money isn't available." "And if it doesn't end? If it goes 2 years like Orin's grandfather said?" It was the honest question, and she gave it the honest answer. "Then I'm in trouble too," she said. "Same as everyone." Tobin sat with that. "You're not afraid of that?" he asked. "I'm not afraid of it," she said, "but I'm more afraid of the other thing." "What other thing?" She picked up the letter and set it aside. "Of becoming the kind of person who would do the other thing," she said. She wrote to Collier. She kept 60% of his contract, That had been the agreement, and she honored it. But she was clear that the remainder was staying local and that no exclusive arrangement was possible. She expected friction. What she got was a brief reply, 3 sentences, that said he understood, that he respected the position, and that he would be renewing his order for the following year on the same terms. She read that letter twice and set it with the certified copies from the courthouse archive, because it felt, in its quiet way, like a document worth keeping. The local selling started the second week of October, and it was immediately more complicated than anything she'd managed before. The problem was not generosity. The problem was logistics. She was one person with a 14-year-old partner, 31 goats, a producing but not abundant farm, and a growing list of families who needed food that she was trying to supply fairly, which meant keeping track of who had paid, who had promised future labor, who was in genuine crisis versus who was merely anxious and buying more than they needed from fear. She established a system. Not a complicated one. She'd never trusted complicated systems, having seen too many of them collapse under their own weight, but a clear one. She kept a ledger at the kitchen table, the same oilcloth-covered table she'd been using since she built the house. Every transaction recorded, every credit noted, every labor arrangement specified with a date and a task. Tobin managed the ledger in the afternoons when Marin was working the herd. He had a handwriting that was better than hers, and a memory for numbers that was almost embarrassing in its precision. He could recall, without checking, what the Holt family owed, what the Birchfield operation had sent 2 sons to do in exchange for 3 weeks of milk supply, what the widow on the South Road had paid, and when. "You should teach school," Marin told him once, watching him work. He looked up with the expression that meant he thought she was not serious. "I'm serious," she said. "I'm not leaving the farm," he said, and went back to the ledger. She didn't press it. There would be time for that conversation later, or there wouldn't be. And either way, it wasn't the conversation that needed to happen today. October deepened and the drought held and the valley got quiet in the way that communities get quiet when they're managing something hard. People moved with more purpose and less conversation. The Saturday market in Briar Hollow went from a social occasion to a practical exercise, and the things that would normally fill the space between people, gossip, complaint, the ordinary texture of small-town life, got crowded out by the larger preoccupation of winter coming and the stores not being what they needed to be. Marin was at the market every week without exception. This was different from before. Before, she'd been a vendor among vendors, a woman with a table of cheese who people had gradually started coming to specifically. Now she was something else, the one consistent supply in an increasingly inconsistent market, which gave her a visibility she found uncomfortable and a responsibility she accepted without particular drama. What she noticed, standing at her table on those Saturday mornings, was the shifting geography of the crowd. People who had walked past her table for months without acknowledgement now made it their first stop. The banker's wife, Harrison Webb's wife, a thin, careful woman named Edith, who had never spoken to Marin directly, came to the table in the 3rd week of October and bought 2 full wheels of cheese and a dozen eggs from the hens Marin had added in September, and paid without comment, and then, as she was turning to go, stopped. "My husband was wrong about you," she said. Not apologetically, just factually, the way a woman who has lived 40 years with a banker learns to state financial assessments. "He wasn't the only one," Marin said. Edith Webb looked at her. "No," she said, "he wasn't," and walked away. That evening, Marin stood at the clearing edge in the last of the October light and looked at the farm. The stone house with the chimney. The well. The orchard, still holding, the leaves turning early because of the drought stress, but still on the branches. The barn foundation, now fully enclosed and roofed with timber from the ridge. Tobin and 2 Birchfield sons had done that in 3 weekends in September, not elegantly but solidly, and the herd was in it every night now, with fresh bedding and water. 31 goats. A kitchen garden still giving, 7 fruit trees alive and 3 now producing, a well at 22 feet and holding. She thought about the day of the auction, the courthouse square, the laughter, the $81 in the leather purse and the $1 she'd had left after. She thought about Daniel and his hands and the practical knowledge those hands had carried. She thought about what he would have made of what she'd done here. He would have been impressed by the chimney find, she thought. He would have been unsurprised by the legal battle. He'd known that being a woman alone with property was an invitation to certain kinds of men. He would have approved of the ledger and the credit system. He would have worried about the drought and the winter and said so directly, without performance of either optimism or despair, and she would have found that grounding in exactly the way she always had. She missed him in a way that had changed shape over 2 years, less acute, more permanent, the way a scar replaces pain with texture. Marin, Tobin from the house door. Coming, she said. November arrived cold and stayed cold, and the drought did not break, which was the worst scenario. Drought and cold together, because cold means animals need more feed, and drought means less of it. And the math of those two things together in a farming community is unforgiving. The families that came up the Ridge Road in November were not the same families that had come in October. October had been the families with some resources and moderate concern. November was the families with fewer resources and genuine fear. The Gideon family. 6 people on 40 acres of bottomland, 3 children under 10, a winter hay store that had come in at half what they needed, arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with a wagon and 2 young sons who couldn't quite hide what they were feeling behind adult expressions. Marin looked at the wagon, at the sons, at the father who had the taut-faced dignity of a man asking for something he would have preferred never to need to ask for. "What can you use?" she said. He named it: milk, cheese, what she could spare from the kitchen garden. He had some coin. Not much. She didn't make him negotiate. "Take what you need," she said. "Write it in the ledger with Tobin, and we'll work out the rest when you can." He looked at her. His face did something complicated. "We can work," he said. "The boys can work." "Spring fencing," she said. "I've got eastern boundary sections that need replacement. Come back when the ground thaws and we'll call it square." He nodded once, the nod of a man accepting terms that preserved his dignity, which she had been careful to make it possible for him to do, because she understood that dignity was sometimes the last thing standing between a person and the kind of collapse that was genuinely hard to come back from. The Gideon boys loaded the wagon. The older one, maybe 12, the same age Tobin had been when he first appeared at the clearing edge, kept looking at the herd moving through the bamboo edge with an expression that mixed curiosity and something that was almost hunger of a different kind. "You want to see them?" Tobin asked. The boy glanced at his father, who nodded. Tobin took them both into the clearing and showed them Martha, the gray-eared doe, now 3 years old and the acknowledged leader of the herd's front section, and let them give her dried bamboo shoots from the pile by the barn. And the boys' faces did what children's faces do when they're allowed to touch something alive and responsive, which has become, briefly, just children instead of small, worried versions of adult problems. Marin watched from the barn door. After the Gideons left, Tobin came back and checked something in the ledger and didn't say anything for a moment. "That's the 11th family this week," he said finally. "I know. We're running the milk reserves down faster than I projected." "I know. How far down can we go before we have to start turning people away?" She had been running this calculation for 2 weeks, and she gave him the honest number. "Mid-December," she said. "If the drought holds and the herd stays healthy and nothing unexpected happens, we can supply at current rate through mid-December." "And after?" "We cut portions and extend to end of January. Maybe February if it's a mild winter." He nodded, processing. "And the orchard?" he said. "Dormant now. Safe until spring. The question is whether spring comes wet or dry." "What does Orin think?" "He thinks the dry cycle runs 18 months in a bad year." She paused. "So, spring is the question." Tobin closed the ledger. "We need to expand the cleared acreage before spring," he said. "More bamboo cleared means more soil moisture retention means more kitchen garden capacity." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this," she said. "I've been thinking about this for 3 weeks," he said. "I didn't want to say it until I was sure the math worked." She sat down at the table. "Show me," she said. He opened the ledger to a page in the back where he'd been making notes. Acreage calculations, soil estimates, water table depth projections based on what the well level had done through the summer. His handwriting was small and precise, and the calculations covered half the page. She read it through, twice. "You need 2 more goats on the western section," she said. "I know, I was going to ask about that." "Ask Orin, he might have a lead on some animals at winter price." "Already did," Tobin said. She looked at him. "When?" "Last Thursday. He said there's a farmer near the county line selling down his herd to get through winter. Younger animals, reasonable price. She thought about cash flow, about the ledger credits, about what she had liquid versus what was promised. How many did Orin think he could get us? 4, maybe 5. Get 4, she said. We don't overpurchase going into an uncertain spring. That's what I told him, Tobin said. She almost smiled. You already told him, she said. I told him we might be interested in 4, he said carefully, subject to your decision. 4 goats, she said. Go get them. The family that surprised her most came on a Thursday in late November, in the thin cold of a morning that smelled like it wanted to snow but hadn't managed it yet. Harrison Webb. Not his wife, not a representative. Harrison Webb himself, in a good coat that was not as good as Silas Crown's had been, and somehow was better for it, walking up the ridge road with a purposefulness that was not quite comfortable. Marin saw him coming from the barn and didn't move to meet him, which was not hostility, but was also not quite courtesy. She let him come to her. He stopped at the barn door and looked around the farm the way she'd seen several people look at it now for the first time, with the recalibration that happened when the reality didn't match the expectation that had been set 2 years ago at a courthouse auction. Mrs. Kestrel, he said. Mr. Webb, she said. He was quiet for a moment in the uncomfortable way of a man who has prepared something and is now uncertain whether to deliver it. I owe you an apology, he said. She looked at him. I turned down your loan application 2 years ago, he said, and I said things at the auction that He stopped. I was wrong. About the land and about you. He cleared his throat. I wanted to say that directly. She thought about the courthouse square, the laughter. You've thrown your money away, the way he'd said it without cruelty, which had almost made it worse. I appreciate that, she said. I also... He shifted his weight. The bank has several families who are in difficulty. The drought. I'm trying to find supply arrangements that will help them through the winter without defaulting on their accounts. I heard that you've been working on a credit system for local families. I have, she said. I'd like to discuss whether the bank can participate, formally, as a guarantor for the families who can't pay directly. He looked at her. So that you're not carrying all the risk of that credit. She looked at him for a moment. Harrison Webb, who had shaken his head at her for a year, who had embodied every institutional doubt about what she was doing, was standing at her barn door asking to help formalize what she'd built. Down, she said. Tobin, bring the ledger. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Webb was a careful man, as it turned out, and careful men were useful when you were structuring something complicated. They worked through the terms together, adjusted twice, argued once about interest language in a way that was productive, and arrived at an arrangement that neither of them had walked in expecting, but both of them could endorse. When he left, walking back down the ridge road, Tobin watched from the door. The bank is guaranteeing the credit, he said. Yes. That means we can extend to more families. Yes. And if the drought breaks in spring and people pay back, we build a reserve, she said, for the next bad year. Tobin was quiet. You thought about this before he came, he said. It wasn't a question. I thought about what I'd want if he came, she said. Which is different. What's the difference? She poured water from the pitcher and drank and thought about it. Hoping for something and planning for it looks similar from the outside, she said. But hoping leaves you surprised when it happens. Planning leaves you ready. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, not the drought-breaking precipitation the valley needed, which would have to be rain and sustained, but the season's first snow falling soft and cold on the cleared acres and the orchard trees and the bamboo still standing at the edges, patiently waiting for spring, when the goats would go back to work and the clearing would push forward and the farm would keep becoming what it was always going to be, one difficult season at a time. The snow that fell that November evening didn't last 3 days. It melted into the ground on a Saturday morning, and the ground absorbed it without drama, the way Marin's soil had learned to absorb things, slowly, deeply, without waste. The bamboo-composted earth held the moisture for 10 days after the snow was gone. She measured it by feel, the way Orin had taught her, pressing her fingers into the ground along the cleared edge each morning to gauge the depth of dampness. And for 10 days it was there, reliable and quiet, doing what good soil does when it's been properly built up over time. The valley fields dried out again in 4. That difference, 10 days versus 4, was not poetic. It was not symbolic of anything larger than itself. It was simply a fact about soil composition and organic matter, and the patient accumulation of decades of decomposed bamboo root, and Marin thought about it in practical terms because that was how she thought about most things. But it also told her something she filed away carefully. What she had built on this ridge was not just a farm. It was a different kind of ground, literally. The land had been changed by what had buried it, and that change was now one of the most valuable things she owned. December arrived and the drought held, as Orin had said it might, and the valley settled into the particular quiet of a community managing a hard winter with insufficient reserves. The Saturday market in Briar Hollow had the subdued efficiency of people who had stopped browsing and were buying only what they specifically needed. Conversations were shorter. The usual seasonal social texture, the visiting between stalls, the extended negotiations that were really just excuses to talk, had been stripped back to transactions. Marin's table was the exception, not because it was festive or warm or anything so simple as that, but because it was consistent. Week after week through December, she had inventory. The quantities varied. She was managing the herd's output carefully. The ledger Tobin kept precisely calibrated against the credit system and Webb's bank guarantee. But there was always something: milk, cheese, dried fruit from the orchard's first modest harvest, which she had put up in September with more care than she'd put into anything that season, because she had understood even then that December was coming and dried pear and cherry went further than fresh. People came to her table with the specific relief of people who have found something they were afraid wouldn't be there. She did not perform generosity at the table. She didn't need to. She sold at one price to everyone, the price she and Tobin had set in October based on what they needed the farm to sustain. Not a charitable price, but a fair one. The same number whether the buyer was Edith Webb or the Gideon family's eldest son, who came every Thursday with a small cloth bag and very careful arithmetic about what he could carry back and what it cost. The credit ledger grew through December. Tobin managed it with a seriousness that was beyond his years and also completely characteristic of him. He had never been a child who did things carelessly, only a child who had learned early that carelessness had consequences that fell on people who couldn't absorb them. On the last Saturday before Christmas, Marin counted the ledger credits after the market and found that she was owed, in future labor and spring payment promises, more work than she could use on 40 acres, she told Tobin. He looked up from his own counting. "That's a problem," he said. "It might be an opportunity," she said. He waited. "Spring comes, drought breaks, people need to pay their debts," she said. "I have more labor credit than I can use. The farms in the valley need workers they can't afford to pay cash for." She set the ledger down. "What if the labor credit is transferable? A family works off their debt to me on a neighbor's farm who needs the help. The neighbor pays me in kind for the referral." Tobin was quiet for a moment, working through it. "You'd be running a labor exchange," he said. "I'd be running a ledger," she said, "which I'm already doing. That's more complicated than what we have now." "I know." "We'd need Webb's bank involved, formally." "I know that too." He looked at the ledger, then at her. "You already talked to Webb about this," he said. "I mentioned the concept," she said. "When?" "When he was here in November." Tobin sat back. "You were planning this in November," he said. Not quite an accusation, more like a man recalibrating a map he thought he'd understood. "I was considering it," she said. "There's a difference." "You keep saying that." "It keeps being true." He almost smiled, which was still, at 14, something he did with less frequency than the situation sometimes warranted. The smile was there, she could see it at the corner of his mouth, and then it was put away in the careful manner of a young man who had decided a long time ago that the world didn't automatically deserve his pleasure. "All right," he said. "Let's build the exchange." January was the hardest month, as January tends to be. The cold was not the brutal cold of some winters. It didn't freeze the well, which had been her main fear, and the barn held heat well enough that the herd was healthy, and the kids born in the first week of the month came into the world with the enthusiastic indignation of animals who have no idea what they've been born into and find everything equally interesting. But the cold combined with the drought's ongoing effect on feed supply meant that every day required a level of management that left her tired in the evenings, in a way that was different from the physical tiredness of the clearing work. This was the tiredness of sustained attention, of having to think carefully about every decision because the margin for error had narrowed. Orin came twice a week still, though he moved more slowly in the cold, and she noticed things about him that she had not let herself notice before. The cane he'd always carried was now load-bearing in a way it hadn't been when she first knew him. His breath in cold air had a sound. He was 73 and he had spent 41 winters on the ridge, and the winters had accumulated in his body the way work accumulates, not breaking it, but marking it, layer by layer. She watched him one morning crossing from the ridge road to the barn and felt something she hadn't expected. Not worry exactly, but a kind of alertness to the fact that Orin Vale was finite. That his 40 years of knowing this ridge, which she had been drawing on the way you draw on a well, was not an inexhaustible supply. She started writing things down. Not systematically, not in the organized way she kept the ledger. She didn't have a framework for it yet. But when Orin said something about the soil or the water table or the way certain years announced themselves in January, she wrote it in a separate section of the ledger that she'd labeled simply OV. Tobin noticed after 2 weeks. "You're recording what he says," Tobin said. "Yes." "Does he know?" "I haven't told him." Tobin thought about this. "Should you?" She thought about it too. "Yes," she said. "Probably." She told Orin on a Wednesday directly, the way she told him everything. "I've been writing down what you tell me," she said. "The land knowledge, the ridge-specific things. I should have asked first." Orin looked at her. "Why didn't you?" he said. "Because I wasn't sure you'd want me to." He was quiet for a moment. "Write it all down," he said. "Every bit. Ask me questions if there are things I haven't told you yet." He paused. "I won't be here forever. The knowledge ought to go somewhere." She nodded. "Tobin," he added. "Make sure Tobin reads it." "Tobin writes most of it," she said. Orin's expression did something she had rarely seen it do, something that was not quite a smile but was in the same family. "Good," he said. February brought the news about Silas Crown. Maggie Tull sent it through Orin, which was the usual channel, and the information was this. The county solicitor had completed the formal investigation. Crown had been removed from the assessor position. The specific charges, abuse of public trust, falsification of notification records, potential fraud in the related property transaction, were being referred to a state proceeding. His lawyer from the city, the one in the better coat, had apparently declined to continue the representation, which Marin filed under things that tell you something without anyone having to say it. She received this information while she was feeding the herd. She continued feeding the herd. Tobin, who had been nearby and heard Orin deliver the news, watched her for a moment. "That's it then," he said. "That's it," she said. "Don't you feel—" He stopped. "What?" "I don't know. Something. More than that." She thought about what she felt, actually examined it, the way she tried to do with important things rather than just acting on instinct. "Relieved," she said. "Mostly relieved." She moved to the next animal. "And tired. A little tired of having had to deal with it at all." "That's it?" "He took my time," she said. "The archive days, the hearing, the 3 months of watching my fence line for boot prints. That time is gone. The farm would have been further along without it." She paused. "I don't feel triumphant about that. I feel tired." Tobin absorbed this. "Orin thinks justice is worth the cost," he said. "Orin's right," she said. "Being right about something and feeling good about it aren't the same thing." Tobin thought about that for longer than she expected. "That might be the most useful thing you've ever told me," he said. She looked at him. "Don't oversell it," she said. The drought broke in March. Not dramatically. There was no single storm, no biblical downpour, no moment of obvious relief. It ended the way hard things often end, which is gradually and then all at once. A week of light rain followed by 4 days of heavy, sustained rainfall that finally saturated the ground past the drought's damage and began refilling the creek from its headwater sources on the upper ridge. Marin was in the barn when the heavy rain started, doing the morning check, and she heard it begin on the roof and stood still for a moment listening to it. Not in the way of a person experiencing a dramatic moment, just listening. The sound of rain on a barn roof when you've been waiting for rain for 8 months is a specific sound that the body recognizes before the mind does. And the recognition moved through her without ceremony and settled somewhere and stayed. The creek at the bottom of the ridge road ran again by mid-March. By the end of the month it was full, running clear and fast over the gravel beds that had been dry since September. The bottomland farmers walked out to look at it the way people walk out to see something they were afraid might not come back. The labor exchange that Marin and Tobin and Webb had spent the winter building activated in April. It worked the way useful things work, not elegantly at first, with adjustments needed in the first 2 weeks as they discovered that certain ledger categories needed subcategories and that the transportation logistics of moving labor from one farm to another required more coordination than they'd planned. But it worked. The Gideon family's eldest son spent 3 weeks on the Birchfield cattle operation, and 2 weeks repairing Orin's fence line, and 1 week on the Ridge Road fencing project Marin had promised the father back in November. And at the end of it, his family's ledger debt was cleared, and the Birchfield operation had gotten 40 days of labor they couldn't have afforded to hire in cash. And Orin's fence was sound, and Marin had her eastern boundary restored. She kept careful track of all of it, but the tracking felt different from accounting. It felt more like tending, which was a distinction she thought about occasionally and didn't discuss with anyone because it was the kind of thing that sounds either obvious or sentimental when said aloud, and was neither, really. It was just accurate. What? Spring settled onto the ridge with the particular generosity of a season following a drought, which is the most generous kind. The orchard trees erupted, all 7 confirmed trees, plus the 2 probable ones that turned out to be a pear and a small apple that had been resisting the bamboo's intrusion for what looked like a very long time, came into blossom inside the same 2 weeks of late April with an exuberance that was almost excessive. The cherry tree, which Tobin had tended most specifically through the drought's hardest months, carried more blossom than Marin had thought a recovering tree should carry. And when she said this to Orin, he said that sometimes a tree that has been through difficult seasons comes back with extra force, as though it had been saving something. She found that she believed him. The herd was 38 animals by May. The 4 winter purchases Tobin had arranged through Orin had come with 2 surprise pregnancies, which was either luck or Tobin's eye for stock, and she gave him credit for the latter because it was more accurate. The goats ranged through the remaining bamboo on the western and northern sections, with the confidence of animals that had been doing this long enough to be good at it, and the sound of them in the morning, that tearing and crunching, that collective purposeful noise, was so thoroughly embedded in Marin's sense of the farm that she couldn't imagine the place without it. 26 cleared acres by June, 14 more to go. She stood at the clearing edge on a June morning that was warm and wet from the previous night's rain and looked at what remained of the bamboo and felt not urgency, not impatience, not the grim determination that had carried her through the first winter. Something closer to patience. The genuine kind, not the performed kind. The patience of a person who has learned that a thing worth doing takes the time it takes, and that fighting that timeline is a waste of energy that the thing will need. Collier came in person in July, the second summer. He arrived the way he'd arrived the first time, in a good coat without apparent concern about mud, and he walked the cleared acreage with the attention of a man who had been thinking about this property since his last visit. He looked at the orchard, which was in its first real fruiting season and not yet producing at volume, but clearly establishing itself. He looked at the barn, properly roofed now, and housing 38 goats with room for expansion. He looked at the house, the stone chimney rising from the center of it, the kitchen garden along the south wall running with summer production. "I want to talk about the next 3 years," he said. They sat at the kitchen table, Marin and Collier and Tobin, who Collier had clearly noticed by now was not simply a farmhand, and adjusted his approach accordingly without being told to. The conversation took 2 hours. Collier wanted a structured supply contract, graduated volume increases over 3 years tied to herd expansion, a price structure that gave Marin certainty and gave him supply reliability, a provision for the orchard fruit once it reached commercial volume. It was a good offer, possibly the best offer anyone had made her for anything. She took it, with 2 modifications. She kept the local allocation at 40% rather than the 35% Collier proposed, and she added a clause that allowed her to reduce city supply in a community emergency without penalty. The drought provision, Tobin called it, when he wrote it into the agreed terms, and Collier accepted it without significant argument because he was fundamentally A man who understood that a supplier who couldn't honor a community obligation in a crisis was a supplier who wouldn't be in business for long. When Collier left, Tobin sat at the table with the signed agreement in front of him. "This is a real contract," he said. "It is," Marin said, "with a city restaurant. For 3 years." "Yes." He looked at it for a moment. "2 years ago you had 1 goat," he said. "1 goat and $81, she said. "Don't undersell the $81. He looked up. "What was the dollar for?" he said. "You always say 81 and I never asked." She thought back to the courthouse square, the leather purse, the arithmetic of the October morning. "I kept $1 back," she said, "in case the auction went to 80 and I needed to eat that week." Tobin looked at her. "Did you need it?" "No," she said. "I bid 80. I had the dollar for a week, and then I used it for fence wire." He shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in the way of someone encountering a fact that makes a story make more sense retroactively. "You were going to bid 80 anyway," he said. "I was always going to bid 80, she said. "I just needed to know I could eat while I figured out what came next." Orin's health declined in the second fall. Not catastrophically. He was 73 and he had been 73 all year, and the decline was the gradual kind that is easy to miss if you're not paying attention and impossible to miss if you are. Marin was paying attention. She had been for months. He stopped coming up the ridge road in September. Not because he decided to stop, he didn't make announcements about such things, but because one morning he simply didn't come, and the next day didn't come. And when Marin walked down to his farm, she found him in the kitchen looking more tired than she had ever seen him and acknowledged, when she asked directly, that the walk was more than he could manage at the moment. She went to him instead. 3 times a week, leaving Tobin to manage the morning herd check, walking down the ridge road to Orin's kitchen and sitting at his table and talking about the farm, about the soil, about the things she still didn't know and wanted to ask while she could ask them. She brought food, framed as an excess she didn't have room for, which Orin accepted with the grace of a man who understood the courtesy being extended and returned it by not making it into something. She sat with him on a September afternoon when the light was the particular amber of early fall, and the windows of his kitchen caught it and held it, and he told her about the ridge in the year he'd arrived, what the soil had been, what the farms had looked like, which families had been there, and which had come and gone. He talked about his wife, which he did rarely, with the directness of a man who had lived alone with a memory long enough to carry it without flinching. He talked about the cherry preserves, the ones his wife had made from the Crown Orchard's fruit before everything went bad, and what the cherries had tasted like, and whether he thought the tree would produce that quality again. "I had some of the first fruit," Marin told him, "from this spring." He looked at her. "And?" She thought about how to be honest and kind simultaneously. "Not yet," she said. "Close. The tree needs another season or 2 of good growth, but there's something in the base flavor that—" She paused. "I think it'll get there." Orin nodded, the slow nod of a man filing information away in a place where he might not get to use it. "Good," he said. She walked home in the amber light thinking about what it meant to tend something you might not see completed. Orin had helped her start a farm he wouldn't see fully cleared. She was tending an orchard whose best years were still ahead. Tobin was learning things that would matter most after she'd taught them. None of that was tragic. That was just how time worked when you were doing something that lasted longer than you did. The first full harvest came in October of the 3rd year. It was not the enormous abundance of a story that wraps up cleanly. It was a working farm harvest, substantial, real, unromantic in its logistics. 40 bushels of mixed orchard fruit, some of it processing quality, some of it the best Marin had ever tasted. Milk production that exceeded the Collier contract's first-year target by 11%, which mattered in a specific cash flow way that Tobin tracked in the ledger with visible satisfaction. The kitchen garden had been expanded twice and produced through a long, warm fall that gave them vegetables into November. On the Saturday market, Marin sold out before noon for the first time. She stood at her empty table at 11:40 and looked at the square and felt, not triumph. She had decided early that triumph was not a feeling she trusted in herself, because it was a feeling that looked forward from what you'd overcome rather than at what still needed doing. And there was always more that needed doing. What she felt was something more grounded, a sense of honest position, of being exactly where she'd decided to be, doing exactly what she'd decided to do and having it turn out to be real. People stopped at her empty table anyway, some to say they'd been too late, some just to talk. The Gideon father stopped and said, without ceremony, that his family had made it through the second summer and the eastern fence section Marin had credited against the debt was solid and holding, and that he was grateful. He said the word directly, the way a man says a word he has decided not to be embarrassed by. "You came when you needed to," she said. "That's what the arrangement was for." "Still," he said. "Still," she agreed. Harrison Webb found her as she was packing the empty table. "The labor exchange is generating interest from 2 counties over," he said. "There are people who want to discuss expanding the model." She looked at him. "That's a bigger conversation than I'm ready for today," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm flagging it." "Flag noted," she said. He almost smiled. He was not a man who smiled frequently, but when he did it reached his eyes, which she had not known about him in the early days when he'd been shaking his head at her courthouse auctions. "You changed something here," he said. "I want you to know I understand that." She picked up the folded table. "The land changed," she said. "I just paid attention." Orin Vale died in January of the 3rd winter, quietly, in his own bed, in his own house, in the way of a man who had arranged his affairs carefully and had no unfinished business he hadn't accounted for. He left his 40 acres to Marin, not as a surprise. He had told her about it in October in the same practical tone he used for most things, with the condition that Tobin have right of first offer if she ever sold, which she had no intention of doing but understood as a statement about what Orin valued. She sat with him the last week. Not constantly. The farm required what it required, and he would have been annoyed at any suggestion that she neglect the herd on his account. But in the evenings, she sat at his kitchen table while he rested, reading from the ledger sections she'd labeled OV aloud to him, the accumulated knowledge of 41 years on the ridge in his own words as recorded by her and Tobin. He listened with his eyes closed and corrected her twice, which was a relief. It meant he was paying attention, and said nothing else until the last evening when he opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling for a moment and said, quietly, almost to himself, "The soil still remembers." She knew what he meant. She had known it since November of the first year, standing in the cold with the chimney above her and the buried farm beginning to emerge around her. The land had not been destroyed by the bamboo. It had been covered. Changed, in some ways improved, made more water retentive and nutrient-dense by decades of organic accumulation. What looked like ruin had been preparation. Not designed, she wasn't interested in that kind of thinking. It required more faith in the architecture of events than she could honestly claim. But real. The land had held what it was through everything that had been laid over it, and when the right hands came to it, it gave that back. "I know," she told him. He died the next morning. She was there. She walked home in the January cold and did the morning herd check and sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and thought about him for a long time. And then she wrote his name at the top of the OV section with the dates of his birth and death and the words, 41 years on the ridge, gave 4 goats and 40 years of knowing, took 1/4 of what the land produced, and earned more than that. Tobin read it that evening without being asked to. He didn't say anything. He put the ledger back on the shelf and went to check on the herd. And she let him go, because grief in young people sometimes looks like work, and work was not the wrong answer. By the 3rd spring, the farm had 31 cleared acres, 9 to go. Marin was 34 years old. She had developed a particular way of walking the clearing edge each morning. Not a ritual, not a ceremony, just a habit. The way you develop habits when you've done a thing the same way for long enough that the body knows it before the mind decides. She walked the perimeter, checked the fence sections, assessed the orchard trees, listened to the herd moving in the bamboo edge, and then stood for a few minutes at the south end where the original foundation wall was, the wall she'd sat on the first day with $81 worth of deed in her pocket and Orin Vale's voice in her ear. The stone chimney rose behind the house. The well produced clean cold water at 20 feet. The cherry tree in the orchard was, this spring, carrying the heaviest blossom it had carried yet. She was not done. She had known from the beginning that done was not the point. The goats were still clearing. The land was still being uncovered. Tobin was still learning, still writing in the ledger, still carrying a competence that had grown past what she'd taught him, into something that was genuinely his own. The labor exchange Webb had mentioned was becoming something. She'd had 2 conversations with county representatives that were preliminary but serious. The Collier contract's second year was running at target. There were fence sections that needed attention. There was a section of the barn roof that had developed a slow leak she'd been watching since February. There was a question about whether to add laying hens beyond the dozen she was running, and when that question would need an answer. It was a working farm. Working farms do not arrive at a point of completion. They arrive at points of different work. She understood that completely and without disappointment. One morning in April, a young woman came up the ridge road. She was perhaps 20, with the look of someone carrying a weight that wasn't luggage, and she stood at the clearing edge the way Tobin had stood at the clearing edge 3 years ago, at a slight remove, watching, not yet committed to the approach. Marin was at the well. "You looking for something?" she called. The young woman came forward. "I heard you bought this land at auction," she said, "for almost nothing, when no one wanted it." $80, Marin said, which wasn't nothing, but yes. "I heard you cleared it yourself and found a farm underneath. Found the bones of one. Had to build the rest." The young woman looked at the clearing, at the house and the chimney, at the orchard trees in blossom, visible through the gap where the western clearing met the still-standing bamboo, at the herd moving in the distance. "I have something," the young woman said, "something people say isn't worth anything, and I'm trying to figure out if they're right." Marin looked at her. She thought about the courthouse square, the leather purse, the laughter. She thought about Orin's voice. The soil still remembers what it was, and the chimney rising out of the bamboo, and the cherry tree coming back, and Tobin's handwriting in the ledger, and all the things that had been present in the 40 acres before she arrived, that had simply needed the right conditions to become visible. She didn't say, "Ignore them." She didn't say, "Believe in yourself." She didn't say any of the things that people say when they are substituting sentiment for thought. She looked at the young woman for a moment, and then she turned toward the house. "Come sit down," she said. "Tell me what you have. We'll work out together whether it's worth something." The young woman followed her. Behind them, at the bamboo edge, the goats continued working, patient, methodical, cheerfully indifferent to everything except the next green thing in front of them. Eating through what no one wanted, one bite at a time, turning obstruction into open ground, revealing, slowly and without drama, what had always been there underneath. The farm was not finished, it never would be, entirely. But it was real, and it was producing, and it was built on the honest arithmetic of clear thinking and hard work, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who had understood, at an October auction in front of a laughing crowd, that worthless and unproven were not the same thing. They never had been. They never would be.